What's going on, guys? Welcome to the Coin Vigilante podcast, where you're going to get to hear a layman talk to some of the most prominent figures in the crypto and finance world as they try to explain some of the most complicated topics regarding finance, economics, stock market, and crypto in general. I will use this as an opportunity to gain a better understanding, and I hope you do as well. You're going to enjoy this next killer episode. And again, I thank you for watching. Let's go. All right. Welcome, guys, to another episode of the Coin Vigilante podcast. So today I'm bringing in my professor that I had at Wright State University. We got Dr. Liam Anderson. He knows, everything about international politics. I took international politics in his class. He has a lot of in-depth, he knows all about history that's going on in the Middle East, international politics, you name it. So without further ado, Liam Anderson, thank you for coming on the show, man.
Sure. So it's going to be a killer podcast, right?
It will be. It will be. So, a lot of people clearly, I interview a lot of people from crypto and, people that have a good following. So they have like 80,000 followers. And after the interview, I put it on Twitter and then they share it. And, they get a ton of views. So I don't know if you're on Twitter, right? I don't know if we're going to get someone to be sharing like 100,000 followers or something like that. But that means a lot of people don't know who you are, right? And so if you could just give us, at least from my audience, right? If you could just give us a little bit of your background of maybe work experience, what you do, how you got into international politics and all that stuff, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I sure. Happy to do that. Yeah, you won't find me on Twitter. I got put on, against my wishes, WhatsApp as for the Model UN thing. And as soon as the conference was over, I just deleted everything. It's not that I'm a technophobe. I just, sooner or later, I'm going to get on one of these things and type the wrong button by accident and post something somewhere, and someone's going to take a screenshot, and that's my life's over, and I'm just. But anyway, I got into politics by accident. I was literally I went to school in the United Kingdom. And there you have to specialize when at the age of 16. You choose 3 subjects to study for the last 2 years of high school. And I wanted to do history. I wanted to do English. Couldn't think of what to do with the third one. And my friend, literally, when we were trying to decide this, my friend poked me and said, do politics. So I put politics down as my third one. I then went to university in England to study psychology and then changed to politics after my first year. So I got a degree in politics at Nottingham University. I then went to Cambridge University to do a master's degree in international politics. Then took a few years off. I went to teach English in Italy for 4 years. Actually ended up owning a school, English language school. And take it from me, if you want to run a small business, do not do it in Italy. It's a complete nightmare. If you're Berlusconi, if you had a big business, your Fiat or somewhere like that, you can not pay taxes at all. You can get the government to pay you taxes. If you're a small business, the taxation's nuts. They changed the tax system, I think, about 5 times in 1 year. The second year I was there. You need a degree just to keep up with this stuff.
Right.
So anyway, 4 years in Italy, and then I came back. I came to America to do my PhD in political science, with a specialization in international relations. And then I applied for the job at Wright State before I earned my PhD, as you typically do. And they offered me a job. And so I took it, and I've been at Wright State ever since.
So that's pretty interesting. So, I do have a bunch of notes today. I had to study up so I can actually ask you decent things.
Okay.
I went through my notes of the previous semester when I was with you, and so I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. But, we're talking about international politics. What would you say are the top 2, top 3 things going on that are catching your attention currently if we're looking at the overall macro environment of international politics? Is it stuff dealing with China? It used to be Middle East. Every time I went on Facebook or anything, I would see news, Middle East, ISIS, all this stuff. Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it just mainly COVID overall? Or is there anything that is right now a big thing?
Well, COVID's obviously kind of a wild card here because nobody quite, there was obviously the attempt to call it the Chinese flu or Chinese plague or whatever, to try and make it an issue in international politics. But I think overall, I mean, I certainly didn't. I don't blame, the country where the outbreak starts. It's not their fault necessarily. I mean, there may have been something stupid done by somebody in that country, but to blame a country for that, because actually the Spanish flu, I don't know if I was going to say if you remember the Spanish flu.
I know a little bit about it. Yeah.
All right. I mean, was essentially started in Europe, but then was taken back to America by American troops, where it evolved into something much more deadly. And then after that, it was spread across Europe, and it was the American strain that killed people. But we don't look upon that and blame America for this. So I think most people look at COVID and actually, for the first time in a while, they see a world of people, of individuals who are all facing the same sort of issue. And in some ways, I think that might help people, I guess, think less nationalistically about the world.
Okay.
I would say the big issues in international politics, I think the Middle East is one. I think you're absolutely right. ISIS has kind of lost its territorial possessions. It's been defeated in that sense, but it's still around. And ISIS-affiliated groups are still in Boko Haram in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, and places like in Yemen. So that idea, it's an idea above all else, rather than an organization or an institution. So I think the Middle East is still going to be. We're in a calm right now in the Middle East, but all of the issues that need to be resolved, none of them have been resolved. And the US, not wisely in my view, is kind of increasing its presence as we speak. I mean, why we have troops in Syria, don't ask me. I think the other two issues, if we leave economics out of it, but I think China is an issue, because we have defense agreements with all of China's neighbors. I think China's trying to expand its power without being threatening to the United States. In other words, its spending on military is 120 billion a year, something like that. If you compare that to the US, 800 billion a year, I mean, China's falling further behind, in military expenditure. But we have the Belt and Road project, and so China's making allies with countries that were once our allies, and so there's certainly a challenge there. And how we deal with that challenge, how we face that challenge, and how we respond to it, I think is going to define probably the next 30 years of international politics. And the slow burner, I think, is Russia and Ukraine. I think, again, it's one of those issues. I don't know why we want to be involved in Ukraine. We seem to want to be involved in Ukraine. We seem to want to get Ukraine into NATO. It's right on Russia's doorstep. Russia isn't going to let that happen. We're just setting ourselves up for failure. And the real problem with confrontation with Russia would be, obviously, I don't see Putin backing down. He's built his political career on being the strong man who doesn't back down, who doesn't flinch, who doesn't blink. And so you could see a confrontation that involves Russia and NATO escalating all the way, and that's nuclear, the lot. So
okay,
that is the kind of slow burner one. It's not on the front pages, but that's Ukraine, Russia, NATO is I think a potentially very dangerous situation.
So going back to what you were saying about collective thinking, more along those lines now with COVID, right? We're kind of leaving the nationalistic type of thing or belief behind a little bit. So, there's one thing that, caught my attention when I took your class, and you were talking about how humans, are basically trained to value immediate family more than others, right? Which inclines us to have a nationalistic feel, a shared identity, right? A feeling of nationalism. And so, if you think about it, and you also talked about the anarchic world, I believe, so where there's anarchy, right? No rules, absence of government. So, within countries.
Graham, you're reading your notes from lecture 5.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So,
you kept them, Carlos. I respect.
but like I wrote some notes and I'm thinking, okay, well, within countries, there's presence of law and order, there's police, right? And so if you look at actual countries, right, individual countries, they also are the same thing as humans, right? We assume that they're rational, we assume that they are self-interested, and we assume that they're power hungry. And so in a place, in a global world where there's, I don't know how many countries there are, 300 countries.
203.
203, right? And each country has their self-interest. Each country is power hungry. How do you see that happening with the current balance of power? Because we discussed it in class too, and basically there's two ways of doing it. Either there's going to be one world power that controls everything, and basically it's either the United States or whatever country conquers the entire world, or each country voluntarily joins one power, which is not going to happen. Or we have deterrence, right? In which we have alliances and we have armies, and we try to deter violence or wars by saying, hey, I'm a big guy, but I'm also a big guy, and if we happen to fight, the whole world collapses. And so could you explain a little bit of maybe that theory of like, look, humans are self-interested, just like countries, right? It's about survival when it comes to anything, right? And in this type of world that we live in, it's kind of like an amoral world, because over and over again, we see countries that step over the lines. And when it comes to morality, even the United States has done some things that they either break the Geneva Convention or they break treaties that we've had in order to have peace or respect human rights, in order for that survival instinct that each country has, right? And when it comes to national interest, there's a lot of countries step over that line. So I don't know if that's a whole lot of things that I just talked about, but if you could just kind of walk through that, that'd be good.
Yeah, you're describing what's generally called referred to as realism within the field of international relations, and so in international relations, what we're trying to figure out is how the world works in a broad sense, not so. So it's climatography rather than weather forecasting. We're not really interested in what happens or predicting what's going to happen tomorrow. We're interested in broad themes and patterns over the next 20 to 30 years. And so for that, to be able to do that, you have to kind of make assumptions that are simplifying assumptions about the way the world works. And so realism works on the assumption that the main actors are states, countries, that human nature is generally, it depends on your version of realism, but it's not positive. We're not naturally inclined to put the interests of others beyond our own interests, let's say. Okay. So we have countries that are operating in an international system that pursue their own interests in this system, and there is no world government. So the absence of an overarching world government with a police force that can enforce laws that are passed presumably in some sort of world parliament. In the absence of that, it's every country for itself. So as a country in this system, I have to put my own survival first, because there's no international police force, except for Team America, of course. And so, there is no international 911. If I get attacked, I can't pick up a phone and phone somebody, and they're going to send Team America around. So it's up to me to look after myself. And so in this sort of environment, the idea that you can have international laws that constrain states and their behavior is kind of a fiction for realists. What international law, because it can't be enforced, essentially, or more precisely, it can be enforced, but it's enforced by powerful states against weak states. So the International Criminal Court, I think, has never put on trial for any sort of war crime or any transgression anyone who isn't from Africa. Right. There may be somebody from Bosnia in there, up there now. But so this is the court that is empowered to try individuals for war crimes, whatever. Well, there are plenty of plausible candidates in the West who could be called, but of course, if you're never going to get in front of the ICC, if you're American or if you're British or if you're German. weak countries get punished by international law, not strong countries. So international law in that sense just reinforces the importance of power in international relations.
Okay.
So did that synopsize well enough?
Yeah, I mean that did. But how would you say? I feel like over the past 100 years, I mean, ever since World War II, there's been a lot more peace than there's been conflict. And I don't know if I'm correct with that belief. So previously, and I believe before the United Nations, or I don't know what treaty or convention, maybe it's NATO. There used to be wars left and right every single year between every country and power that was in Europe. I mean, constantly. Now, I don't think we've seen a single war going on between a European country against another that would cause another World War III. And so what is it that caused more peace over the time? I mean, at least over the past 100 years, is it that collective agreement of NATO to where, I mean, I don't know if you can explain that.
Sure. I mean, you're looking at now, it's close to 80 years of peace. And we're talking about peace in terms of the absence of major power wars, right? I mean, there haven't actually been very many wars between states, even. I mean, Iran-Iraq War, 1980s, Eritrea, Ethiopia, El Salvador and somebody fought a war over a football game. Mm-hmm. But they're few and far between. But in terms of for something to become a world war, you're absolutely right. Europe was the epicenter of 2 world wars. What I think, I mean, if you ask Europeans this, they'll tell you they've transcended war as a means of settling disputes. They've established the European Union, and that's brought everybody together, and they all have a European identity now, and they resolve their disputes peacefully, whatever. Fine. If Europeans want to think that, that's great. In my view, it's the presence of US troops in Europe since the end of World War II is what's provided the peace. Now, within that peace provided by the United States and the presence of US troops in Germany in particular, then sure, the Europeans can, merge their economies and become a EU and whatever. But the reason why US troops in Germany was absolutely critical is because the real question after World War II is, what do we do with Germany? They've basically started 2 world wars, the second of which they tried to slaughter 6 million Jews just because of their identity. What do we do with Germany? Germany's too big to be in Europe. And so the British and the French actually both said, we need to chop it up. We need to dismantle Germany.
Right.
The Americans fought to keep Germany together. And the problem then becomes, if you're elsewhere in Europe, you're thinking, okay, so Germany's going to increase, it's going to carry on increasing its power. It's going to rearm. It's going to, when Germany reunified in the early 1990s, it's a threat to everybody in Europe. What the US troop presence does in Germany is it guarantees that increases in German power aren't perceived by everybody else in Europe as a threat, because the US is there, and the US will not allow Germany to go rampaging across Europe again. So it's what's termed the security dilemma is when me taking steps to defend myself can be perceived by my neighbors as potentially threatening to them. So, I mean, on a individual type basis, if you're my neighbor, Carlos, and you see me go out and come back armed with guns and whatever, I can tell you that I'm doing this to defend myself and protect myself. But you've better be 100% certain these guns aren't being bought to threaten you with.
Right.
In fact, probably you would go out then and you'd think, well, okay, if this guy gets drunk or gets wired up on crystal meth or something, and he's so heavily armed, he could come and attack me and take my stuff and whatever. So you go out and you buy your guns to protect yourself. Again, we're now heavily armed, even though both of us only want to protect ourselves. And that's a kind of dynamic that can happen in international politics. The presence of US troops in Germany prevented that from happening. It solved Europe's security dilemma. So I would say US has been absolutely critical in this.
So, I mean, when I think about it, so we're talking about world order. There's not a world order or a police state, basically. But if you think about it, the United States is basically the world order. I mean, if you look at all the bases that there are in the entire world that are military U.S. bases, they're everywhere and they're scattered around the world. And so, when I think of world order, I kind of view the United States as that. And, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I clearly am not an expert in any of this, but it's going to be interesting because I'm sure China and Russia are going to be doing something to, try to shift the balance of power a little bit. But, I want to ask a few questions because in my opinion, right, and opinions of other people, right, I think less government control is usually better in respect to certain areas or certain industries. So, for example, free markets, I think, benefits more of the economy, right? And, part of my I'm hesitant to sometimes believe what the government says because the government has had a tendency to actually lie to its people. So if you look at the Iraq war, yes, a lot of patriots died, blood was shed in the battlefield, but the war was based on a lie, right? Apparently, they were creating nuclear weapons or something like that. Nothing at all. It was based on a false accusation, right? Then you look at Snowden. What is Edward Snowden doing, right? Currently, the United States would kill him if they could or put him in prison if they could. But I don't know. I mean, do you call him a patriot? Do you call him, I mean, that's the underlying question, right? And so we're talking about, what he disclosed is that the United States is spying more on its own people than on actual enemies. And it's actually spying on every single person. Like right now, they're spying on me right now. I don't know. They're probably not, but they could with a click of a button. And the thing is, and I saw clips, I saw Barack Obama talk about it. I saw, high profile people from the government say, we're not spying on you. Then all these leaks happen. Yes, they're spying on us and they're spying on other people. And so I feel like right now we're at a point in time where people have high distrust of government, of politicians, and of things like that. So, what's your take of that? Because, even looking at what the CIA has done, it's unbelievable. They have messed with, I'm trying to look for my notes here. There's just too many. But look at this. Conducted assassinations. What else have they done? Overthrown democratic governments. Helped transport drugs from Latin America to U.S. with government help. Conducted, or participated in terrorism. They've tortured. They've trained Islamic, wingnuts. The list goes on. And all of what the CIA does is for the best of national security. Well, at which point are people going to have enough, where, government control is getting too strong? If President Biden right now wanted to bomb anyone with a drone strike, he could, and I don't even know if he would need congressional approval. So, you know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying, look, oh my God, I hate the U.S. government. I want to go to the woods and, live on my own and just not deal with any I'm not saying that, but there's high distrust in the government. We've seen that the government has lied to our faces. What do you say to that? Do you have an opinion based on that?
I absolutely, all governments lie to their people. It's just the nature of the beast. And the thing they're most likely to lie about is going to war. Because essentially the sales pitch is always going to be, we're the good guys, we have right on our side, we're doing this for the benefit of the world, or that sort of sales pitch. Whereas most wars in the Middle East are about oil, and that's actually not a stupid thing to fight about. I know it's unpopular, but we have an oil-based economy. If we don't have oil, we have no economy. The whole global system grinds to a halt. It's a vital national security interest. But you can't get up and say that as a politician, because it makes you look kind of ruthless and whatever. So that instead they get up and say, oh, these people are being brutalized by this guy who's just like Hitler, and we got to go and take him out and whatever. So politicians lie all the time to their people. And I think some politicians treat the people as kind of stupid and not worthy of being told the truth. But I think your point about distrust of government is absolutely valid. I don't remember it being ever as low as this across the board. I mean, across the world. And I think it's ultimately something of a threat to democracy. I think if you certain healthy distrust of government's a positive thing. But if you can't actually trust, against all the evidence, that votes cast in an election after were free and fair, more or less, then what's left of democracy? And if you have half your population doesn't believe the president was legitimately elected, that's a real problem. And the other thing I think you're spot on is that the threat of government takeover. I mean, a lot of Republicans talk about socialism, and so they see Obamacare or something like that and say, oh, socialist nightmare or whatever. The US government is never going to take over the economy of the United States. And it would be very stupid to do that, because it's the most obvious thing we learned during the 20th century is that socialism as a system-wide economic system is kind of a disaster. It doesn't work. Free market generates wealth. I personally think you need to provide free access to education for everybody, and I think everybody should get access to healthcare. That it has to be accessible to everybody, whether that's run privately or publicly or whatever. I don't really care. Education, healthcare has got to be provided to anybody. After that, the government needs to bugger off and leave the economy alone, because it does a less efficient job than the free market does. The only caveat to that, of course, is the environment, right? Which is, as a private producer, I can I can pump all of my pollution into the atmosphere and pay no price for it, unless the government regulates it. Somebody else pays the price for me polluting the river. It costs me money to not pollute the river. I've got to do something with the waste rather than just dump it in the river. If the government doesn't force me to do that, I'm just going to dump it in the river. And at that point, that's a problem, right? So it's a collective problem created by my self-interest. And I think that's a problem that free market economies are hopefully going to grapple with moving forward, because if they don't, we're all toast. But I forgot what your actual original question was. But
you basically covered it all. When you're talking about free market, so basically, it distributes wealth much better than socialism. But if you look at it, right? Bringing the economic side to this, we have basically the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, right? Since the pandemic started, right? Especially low-class people and middle class have been pummeled to the ground. We're talking about restaurant workers, right? You name it, right? The stats are out there. High unemployment. People are still not recovering from such crisis. Yet we're seeing one of the world's worst wealth disparities occur in the United States and maybe the rest of the world, and one of the worst economic crises since the Great Depression. So, what's your take on that? Because if you look at it, billionaires have actually more than doubled, maybe tripled their wealth over this time span. And on top of that, think about it. All the printing that's been going around through the Federal Reserve, that's not going to people's hands. If you look at the price of real estate, it's increased. If you look at the price of commodities, increased. Price of equities, increased, right? Stock market is at all-time high when bad news after bad news after bad news keeps arising, right? They're not even generating earnings, no profits, revenues dropping. And so when you look at all this money that's being injected into the economy, it's actually only benefiting the top 10%, because the top 10% own 50% of all assets, while the rest of us own 2 to 5% of all assets. So, and again, that's also distrust, and people don't realize it yet. And I think part of it is a complacency factor that we see in the Western world, because people in Venezuela, they don't trust the banks. They don't trust the government. Why? Look at the hyperinflation. They're actually burning their bills, right? Their cash to keep themselves warm at night. That's how worthless they've made their currency to be. And so when I look at the current situation, the only reason why, shit hasn't hit the fan And
we're allowed to say shit on this podcast?
We are. Yeah, okay. We are. I mean, the reason why things are not as bad in the U.S. is because we have the world reserve currency. However, look at what happened to Germany. I mean, Germany was a flourishing economy, right? And the Weimar thing happened, right, with their currency. So I don't know what is your take on that? Because a lot of people here in the U.S. still don't distrust the current fiat system because there's no need to, right? They're happy and they're really loving those $1,000 stimulus that each week and month that goes on are worth less and less and less. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it makes me mad because I know the issue, but I don't know if you have a take on this.
I kind of share your perspective on this. It seems to me that what we've done, I don't know if when I looked into it after the crisis in 2008, a couple of economists went out and tried to figure out how much wealth was just created out of nothing. In other words, what are the, Federal Reserve calls it various programs to do this, quantitative easing, whatever it is, but it's printing money essentially. It's creating wealth out of nothing. And they figured out that in fact, in the 10 years after 2008, there was something like $30 trillion of wealth had just been kind of conjured up from somewhere. So this isn't based on anything. There's no store of value. It's essentially just akin to printing. Exactly. And of course, the world would be fantastic if we could just print the money. Why not make everyone a millionaire? You just print off $1 million for 350 million people. Bingo, we've solved all our economic problems. Poverty's over. But of course, you're right. The problem is inflation, right? You can't just print money because the more money you print, the less each bit's worth and whatever. So I think inflation, as far as I'm aware, is only about 3% right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, if it depends on what you base inflation on, right? The CPI index doesn't include some of the things that people actually need.
Right,
so,
sure,
I mean.
okay. Right, but I mean, as long as we're using a consistent measure across time, then there's something, but you're right, I'm sure it doesn't, it's like Dow Jones only captures about, 30 companies or whatever it is. But I think the world's reserve currency issue is the key thing here, because what it does means that there's a demand for dollars, right? Yeah. And so you can print money as long as people want it, as long as it's not all just circulating in the same place. So if you print $1 trillion and the Saudis come in and say, all right, we'll take that. We want to store trillions of dollars, whatever. So as long as there's a demand for dollars, you can just print wealth without inflation.
Right.
The problem is we lose control over when the bubble pops, because it isn't up to us anymore, because so much of our wealth, our created wealth, belongs to other people. If China were to decide, it would be self-destructive for China to do this, to liquidate all of its US holdings, what's the dollar worth after that, or the Saudis or whatever. So I think there's a bubble here that's gonna pop at some point, because you can't keep flooding the world with dollars endlessly. And we can't predict it because you don't know what the event is going to be that pops the bubble. We didn't predict it, and nobody predicted it in 2008, really.
Right.
And so it's unknowable. But it's not quite a Ponzi scheme we're on, but it's an economic system that doesn't have much of a foundation to it, except the collective belief that dollar bills are worth something. What does it take to pop that belief? I have no idea, but a war with China would do it. But it could be something small, like Middle Eastern countries deciding that they want oil denominated not in dollars anymore, but in euros, let's say. Now, even though oil itself is not a huge part of the world trading system, psychologically, that tells me as an investor, all right, dollars on the way out. Euros what I want. I'm losing all my dollars. I'm selling all my dollars. And so suddenly all the dollars come back into circulation. You get your hyperinflation, and then we're in trouble.
Right. But then if you think about it, I mean, you're just talking about the Middle East. Let's say they want to denominate their oil or something else on something different. That is what was happening. I think it was Saddam Hussein who was doing that. And guess what? We bombed the living hell out of their country, conquered it basically. And, oh, well, that idea, you know, is already out of the picture, right? And of course, you know, I think they were claiming that, you know, he wasn't a good guy, obviously. I know there were all bad things that were going on there, but when you always look, there's bad guys all over the world, but we get to pick and selectively decide which ones we go after. If, back to the theory that you were talking about at the beginning, if it is to the best of our national interest, right? And so that's the interesting thing. But, you know, another interesting thing is the following, right? When people start realizing that their purchasing power continues to be devalued based on this rigged financial system that we live in, right? As trillions are printed, like look at it right now. So I have a fiance. We've been looking for houses.
Good luck with that.
Exactly, right. And we are actually getting a house, but we're paying top dollar for it, right? We have to, I mean, in this market, you have to offer 20 to 30% over the asking price. And so if you think about it, our paychecks over the past, actually ever since the gold standard was taken out, have not been keeping up with the inflation in real estate and stocks, anything of that sort, right? In fact, our purchasing power has been decreasing while our paycheck has not been increasing at all, right? When compared to inflation. And so the middle class and the lower class is getting priced out of real estate, which you need to live. And the Gen Zers, millennials, are getting priced out of the economy. You cannot tell me that at some point people are not going to figure it out, and that you're going to see externalities from this, because people are going to see frustration arise from this, whether they know or not what's causing the problem. Think about it. I mean, money is one of the most important things in the world, whether you like it or not, right? People like to say, yeah, happiness.
I like money.
I like money, right? And you need money to have a certain lifestyle. Now, when people start realizing that lifestyle that your grandpa used to afford, just earning pennies, and now you're earning $1,000, but you can't even afford a fraction of the lifestyle that your great grandpa used to afford, I think it's going to cause externalities. And that's where the distrust is happening with central banks, with government. And that's where Bitcoin comes into place, because Bitcoin was created in 2008 based on basically the principle that states, you know, for the past, you know, ever since, I guess gold is the only thing that states can't control or print, but, you know,
they can, can't they? They can control it because gold is on someone's territory.
Right. So, okay. So that's true, right? So Bitcoin, though, is not state-controlled money. Right. And right now we have state-controlled money, like similar to how we're talking about markets being controlled by either government or leaving free markets go. Think about it. It's a whole nother dimension to where now we have money that is not being controlled by a particular state. It cannot be printed away. There's only 21 million Bitcoins. And there can be no corruption at all, because it's based on a distributed ledger that anyone can access on the internet. As long as you have internet, it's going to be there. And when you think about this, so you were talking about, well, what if the Middle East decides not to go with the dollar, or China not go with? Well, now we have Bitcoin, and dollars, more and more dollars are being converted into Bitcoin, right? So dollars are exiting, and then they're going into Bitcoin, right? An alternative currency that no state controls. And it's already becoming a big thing. In 2017, anyone that was talking about Bitcoin, I mean, it was a joke, right? It was only to make money. Now we're seeing some of the largest institutions convert the melting ice cube, that's what they call it, sitting in their balance sheet, into Bitcoin. Why? Because it actually has store of value properties. It actually has the properties of money, which is a medium of exchange, unit of account, right? Store of value, all those things. So I think and not only that, you know, there's also Ethereum, there's also other blockchains and decentralization, which allow basically corruption to be gone, fraud to be gone. And it's the trust issue, because what blockchains do is everything is in a distributed ledger. Everything that's in a blockchain is true, and no one can tamper with it. And so whether that's information that you store in a blockchain, whether it's an article that I publish, no one can copy it, right? My money, my Bitcoin is my Bitcoin, and it's there. I control it. I have the keys. No bank can use it to lend it out. It's mine. No central bank can use it to print it out because it's capped at 21 million. It's an open source distributed ledger. So, when I talk about this, and I don't know how, I don't know if you're an expert with Bitcoin or if you have a good understanding of it, but as I'm telling you this, do you see this as maybe a shift? Just like the internet was a technology that, flourished. Do you see this as a possible alternative to the current currency system? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that, in a sense, what you've just described there is precisely the reason why there's going to be quite a lot of resistance on the part of states to this, because it's the creation of money outside the control of states. If you're the United States, a lot of your power basically comes from the military, but that's a function of money in the end, how much you can put into that. But also the dollar itself. The dollar itself as a reserve currency. We want to increase the quality of our lives. We can print dollars. People want, there's a demand for dollars, whatever. If we were to go to Bitcoin, suddenly what does the US government do? I mean, in terms of being able to manipulate the tools of the economy to engineer a boom or to crack down on things, they lose one of the most powerful tools in their arsenal. And so they're not really willingly going to be doing that, right? Because I think the sea change here is if Bitcoin can be used to pay taxes. If states start accepting Bitcoin in lieu of taxes, or by way, as payment for taxes, that's game over for state control of money.
But think about it, though. I mean, you bring a good point, but also think about it. If they can print trillions, they literally go to a computer and hit command print and add a bunch of zeros. I've literally seen them say, I've seen a Federal Reserve chair and president say it in a 60-minute interview. We have infinite liquidity. We can print an infinite amount of cash if we want to support the economy. If you can print an unlimited amount of cash, do we really need to pay taxes? That's a question. Now, the only reason that I can come up with, and based on the research I've done, that we need to pay taxes is so that there's demand for the dollar, right? You need to pay taxes with dollars, so there needs to be demand for dollars, which makes sure there's no currency flight to another, right? So you got to pay with dollars, So that's also interesting because I know, the US is going to have some friction with Bitcoin, but when you think about it too, what did the internet do? I'm sure the government, I don't know if the government was a whole lot for it at the beginning, because the government used to control basically all communication.
The government built it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And so the crazy thing is that the free market ended up using the internet to the advantage of people. Now, obviously, governments are always going to find a way to get control off of a new technology. But think about it. Now, anyone out there can actually inform themselves. They don't have to go through government-sponsored. I mean, just look at other countries, like communist countries. The only way that you used to get your knowledge was through their propaganda. Then what happened? The internet flourished. Those countries don't like it, but they can't shut down the internet. Anyone can go on the internet and actually learn what the truth is. And so my point is you won't be able to shut down Bitcoin. It will be impossible unless you actually shut down the entire internet. Because what happens with Bitcoin is you have the miners that we talked about, right, before the podcast. Mining is just basically computing power. I could be using this computer right now to be mining Bitcoin. So I'm not doing anything at all. The computer is doing all the work. And what the computer does is it uses its computing power to strengthen the Bitcoin blockchain, right? The network. And so by participating in the network and contributing to the network, I get rewarded a fraction of a Bitcoin, right? Based on how much computing power my computer is using. So a lot of people actually invest in this. They have like warehouses full of Bitcoin miners. And so the thing is, you would have to actually destroy any computer that is mining Bitcoin all over the entire world. It would have to be a world order type of thing, law. Yeah. Hey, everyone has to abolish the Bitcoin miners if we want to destroy Bitcoin. It's impossible. It's genuinely impossible.
Let me ask you a couple of things then, Carlos. So if it's down to the power of your computer, basically. So in other words, you got at the moment, it's not a finite source of Bitcoin, right?
Right.
It's not infinite, but it's because I assume it takes some time to earn fractions of Bitcoin or whatever. But you say 21 million of Bitcoin now?
There will only ever be 21 million. So currently there's about 18 million that have been basically mined, or in other words, printed, right? It's going to keep going until it reaches that 21 million cap. And that's about it.
Because I think one of the arguments against tying things to things like the value of gold is the fact that the source itself is finite. That when your economy increases in its productivity and you have population growth, and so your economy expands, you need also an expansion in the money supply.
Right.
Right.
And so what I would say to that is the fact that Bitcoin is highly divisible. And so, if you go to Coinbase.com and you go to an exchange, you can buy a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of Bitcoin. You can buy $1 worth of a Bitcoin. And at that point, you own, we call it Satoshis. So it's a much smaller unit of account for Bitcoin, right? So either you own a whole Bitcoin or you own Satoshis. So it's just like $1,000 bill, $1 bill. I would say that would be the way I confront that argument, in that ultimately no one is going to get priced out of Bitcoin because you can own a fraction of anything, right? So in the near future, if Bitcoin ever gets to $1 million, right, you can own $1 worth of Bitcoin owning 0.00000001 Bitcoin. And so I don't know if that makes any sense, or I don't even know if that kind of responds to that argument or not, but.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what you're suggesting is that the Bitcoin itself, I mean, it's this. I guess and it's not an argument. I think wealth or money needs to be tied. It can't just be purely conceptual, because it isn't. That, as you point out, there's a very clear relationship between money in circulation, quantity of money in circulation, and prices. You can't get around that. Inflation has occurred throughout human history before even people had a name for it. It was occurring anywhere where things are exchanged. Some things are in scarce supply, some things are in excess supply. It's just a kind of law of life, as it were. But I did want to ask you as well about what's to prevent then the people with the most powerful computers from being the ones that benefit the most from Bitcoin. So in other words, a transition to Bitcoin could potentially increase income inequality further than it is right now. I mean, the first thing, if I'm the Chinese government, I get myself my supercomputer and I get mine in my Bitcoin and whatever, or US has more powerful computers than China.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point, because currently what's happening is most of the computing power and miners performing the work are in China. And I don't know. I mean, almost everything is controlled by the government, right? I mean, everything, like the government literally pays private companies, right, just to pump them up and get them to get rolling. So if you think about it, it's going to basically be an arms race of who's going to be able to have the most computing power to mine Bitcoin, right? Either the United States is going to fall behind on this technology, or you're going to so here's the thing, right? It's similar to the internet. Imagine if the United States were to be the one that said, no, we don't want people to have more power in terms of information and use the internet to better themselves. So we're gonna block that from being a technology in our country. The United States would have been at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of everything in terms of economy, in terms of GDP, in terms of technological advancement, if the United States were to block off one of the most innovative technologies in history, right? Which is the internet. Luckily, the United States actually embraced it, right? What's happening right now? The United States and every country out there has one option. If Bitcoin actually ends up working, and it actually is used as an alternative currency, it's never going to replace a dollar. Don't get me wrong on that. It's never going to replace existing currencies. However, it's going to be an alternative, and it's going to be a store of value, similar to gold. No one's gotten rid of gold, right? It's always been there, except now we have this innovative technology, which it's a whole new paradigm shift. We have China and private companies in China that are actually using most of the computing power for Bitcoin, while other countries are falling behind. So that's where these countries are going to have to figure out, look, are we just going to let them take over? And it's that thing. It goes back to that balance of power. You know, the United States could say, oh, Bitcoin is a piece of crap, right? We have the world reserve currency, until you don't. And then, and we have senators now that are Bitcoiners. They actually own Bitcoin. So little by little, we're seeing the United States actually embrace it with more open arms. They're not going to be like, oh my God, we love Bitcoin, we're going to replace some of our dollars with Bitcoin. I don't think that's going to happen. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's an open conversation. I'm not an expert 100%, but if that makes sense to you, I would think that, in my opinion, more countries would want to wake up to it as this thing starts to become more successful. And the countries that do end up embracing it are going to be the ones that are rewarded. So, and it's part of a free market type of thing, right? Because it's not state controlled. Each country has the opportunity to either embrace it or not.
But in that sense, I mean, why is it notably different? And again, I'm not either a critic or a fan of Bitcoin. It's one of those, I think it's a really smart idea. I don't know that the governments of the world are going to embrace it, rather than, because really all they have to do is say that's illegal currency in our country. And it is, right? There's nothing, it's not like you can knock on the taxpayer door, the tax collector's door, and say, well, here's some Bitcoin. If Bitcoin's not recognized as a legitimate currency by anybody, and it's states who make this decision, right? So right. States will ultimately decide this. But in the sense, why is it different from credit cards, let's say?
Well, it's different because
the states don't control credit cards.
They don't, but I mean, it's different because, for example, the Bitcoin that I have right now, so I have whatever Bitcoin in my wallet right here. I mean, if the US were to ban Bitcoin, they actually can't, because it's an open source network. Just like the US can't really ban the internet. I mean, it's almost impossible, right? And no government or central authority is able to stop me sending a transaction from my Bitcoin wallet to another Bitcoin wallet anywhere in the world. No one can, because of the technology that Bitcoin runs on. It's an open source protocol. So one thing, if the government of the US does say we're banning Bitcoin, well, what does that do? I mean, yeah, maybe I can't use it.
No, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it like that, because clearly, I mean, I can interact with you privately with Bitcoin. Yeah. If I have something to sell you, you want to buy a fridge from me, and you say, I'll give you half a Bitcoin. No, but if the US government says Bitcoin is not a recognized currency with respect to anything involving anything to do with the federal government, so you can't pay taxes with it, you can't pay bills with it, you can't pay school fees with it, you can't do anything where money interacts with the federal government, you can't use Bitcoin. That, I don't know, I mean, it doesn't kill Bitcoin, but it prevents Bitcoin from being the revolution that it might otherwise be.
Yeah, I mean, I do think so, but if you actually see what's going on, there is actually a lot of development going on with local governments and state governments. So, for example, in Florida and Miami City, they're actually now paying. So the mayor of Miami is now paying state employees and local employees in Bitcoin. They can choose to accept Bitcoin if they want, and if they choose to. So it's becoming an optional thing. Okay. And they're also in the works of actually accepting people paying taxes in Bitcoin. So it's going to be an interesting thing, because I'm assuming the federal government is going to have a different stance. But fortunately, we live in a country too where we have state governments, local governments that are able to actually decide for themselves. And so
Well,
we're actually seeing a lot of progress being developed. And so I don't know if you heard, PayPal now allows anyone with a PayPal account to pay with Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Ethereum at 400 million merchants if they choose so. So the private market is like on it quickly. And so it's a good point. I mean, I'm definitely going to have to do some research on that. I don't know if the US would actually take such a strong stance. I mean, I think it's going to be so ingrained already in the system that it's going to be quite literally impossible, because a lot of people already depend on Bitcoin. I mean, you would be crushing a lot of people's wealth that they currently hold. And the more that the private market uses it, the more that the private market depends on the success of Bitcoin. And so I don't know.
I think you're right. The kind of Achilles heel for the US here, I mean, it's a positive thing if you support Bitcoin, is that as a federal system, the 50 states have leeway and flexibility to do things that the federal government, A, wouldn't do, and B, can't stop them from doing. And so if the state of Ohio wants to accept Ohio income taxes in Bitcoin, ain't a damn thing US government can do about it, the federal government. So
right.
I would agree with you. I would think I'm surprised it's Florida, honestly.
Yeah.
But the more imaginative states, I would be thinking something, California or Washington or something. But well, good for Florida. It's done something right in its life.
It is good. It is good for them.
And I don't think anything bad comes from it. It doesn't seem to me, however you cut and slice it, cut and dice it, or whatever, that Bitcoin, I don't see the downside to it, I guess. It doesn't seem to me that it's an inherently, and I think it can be, in a sense, it's more democratic. Though I am concerned a little bit that mining requires computer power. So those with the most computer power become the wealthiest. And the wealthiest then buy more computers with greater computing power and whatever. That concerns me a little bit. But, more power to it. I think the way the system runs right now, and you said it well yourself, I mean, it is essentially kind of corruption. I mean, I was staggered after 2008 when we were chucking money at banks, not just bailing them out, but then loaning them money at 0% interest, and not actually saying you've got to loan this to people. I mean, that was the idea, was we'd loan money to banks, and the banks would then, that would kickstart the loaning. The banks lent them back to the US government, bought treasury bonds from the US government with the money, money we just printed for these buggers, gave them interest free. They lent it back to the US government and earned sort of 3% on, I mean, it's nuts.
Right.
You couldn't write this stuff in a fictional.
You'd think it's a conspiracy, but it's not.
Right. And so, unfortunately, the current system, banks are too big to fail, as they've always been. And so we hit the next crisis, we're going to have to bail out the banks. And the argument will be, if we don't bail out the banks, the whole global economic system crashes down. We can't afford to let that happen. So whatever it takes to bail out the banks. And we're going to keep repeating that cycle. So I think that's a very dangerous cycle to keep repeating, because it actually isn't endless. You can't keep doing that.
And people are getting tired of it. I mean,
and each time you go through the cycle, you impoverish more people and concentrate wealth more at that top end, and it increases this disparity in income, and it's bad for society and all the rest. So in principle, at least, I have nothing. I think anything that Bitcoin can do to democratize either wealth creation or the spread of wealth or whatever, I'll fully support it. So,
gotcha. I don't know if you have a couple more minutes, or are we getting close to an end here?
I'll give you another couple of minutes, and then.
Okay. All right. So, I kind of sponsored this on my own Twitter when I was describing this interview that we were going to have. So I thought it was incredibly interesting. When I see governments do certain things, they like to use things that are happening around the world to their advantage, whether it's actually COVID, whether it's the Iraq war, whether it's anything that's going around, just like we talked about with Saddam Hussein. They call it, we're freeing people. When in reality, it's for another purpose. So 9/11 happened, and there were a lot of things that changed. We used to have the Geneva Convention, which basically protects humanitarian rights for people. And then 9/11 happens. Bush has a decision to make. We have to make certain things happen to where we need to get information out of people so we can prevent this from happening again. And so could you walk me through just the crazy stuff that happened? So basically he enacted, there was a certain law, and basically torture is illegal under humanitarian laws, right? And I remember in class we discussed it, and Bush actually got some legal counsel to actually try to determine what is the actual definition of torture so that we can actually get stuff out of people. I don't know. When I heard about this, it kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, it was after 9/11. So the problem really is the Bush administration didn't know what was coming next, right? And it's not because they were totally incompetent. It's because once you set up the NSA to have this capacity to suck in information from everywhere, you get a different set of problems. It's not access to the information. It's what do you do with all this warehouses full of information? What's important, what isn't, whatever. Right. And so after 9/11, we didn't know, the Bush administration didn't know what was coming down the pike. It might have been a biological weapons attack on Los Angeles. Who knows? Because they didn't know, they had to get information. And so they went sweeping up people off the battlefield in Afghanistan, off the streets of Milan, Italy, whatever. Wherever they had suspected Al-Qaeda guys were, they swept them all up, stuck them in Guantanamo Bay, and then initiated the harsh interrogation technique regime, which included waterboarding, which is and always has been torture. But then you encounter a problem that if you're going to use waterboarding, that's torture, and therefore you're going to be, and it's not really the international, I mean, there is a convention, an international convention against torture, but who's going to enforce that, right? So that wasn't the concern. The concern was the War Crimes Act, that's a domestic law, and it's therefore enforceable, which prevents you from torturing, and I think it punishes grave violations of Geneva Convention, and you're not allowed to torture and whatever. So if you torture people domestically, your President Bush or your CIA guys, whoever's doing the torturing, you can potentially be held account under domestic law and spend your life in prison after this is over. Right. So that what they did was redefine what torture is. And the way it was, Bush administration got their legal counsel, John Yoo, and he went away and he stole a definition it was actually from a Medicare statute. So the Convention Against Torture says the infliction of severe pain, mental or physical. So he goes to the Medicare statute and says, okay, what's severe pain according to this? So it's this section of the Medicare statute that deals with emergency treatment. So what qualifies an emergency? So he looks at that and he says, okay, so it's loss of a limb, collapse of internal organs, whatever. And so he says that's obviously something like severe pain. So that's the definition we're going to adopt in terms of what constitutes torture. So as long as what you do isn't equivalent to chopping someone's limb off or destroying their internal organs, it's not torture.
So you're saying drilling teeth or maybe electricity to their genitals, anything is A-okay unless you're not impairing their organs or it's not close to being dead.
Yeah. So that was their redefinition. And of course, waterboarding is, I mean, it's essentially drowning people, but you don't carry it through to the end. But by that standard of what constitutes torture, waterboarding's fine.
And the CIA is exempt from doing it, right? Like from falling under those laws that require you to not torture people or something like that.
This is here's what actually happened when Obama came into office. He said, all right, we're not going to do this anymore. Here's the Army Manual's Code of Conduct for Interrogation. That's now the rules across the federal government. The CIA was initially exempted from that, but I think Obama actually now put them under it. But here's the get out of jail free card, is that this practice of shipping detainees off, or you capture someone on a battlefield in Iraq or Syria or whatever, you send them off to Jordan, and you have a little office in Jordan somewhere in the middle of the desert that's defined as US territory or whatever. You put the guy there, and you allow Jordanian internal security officials to interrogate the guy to get. So you outsource torture basically.
Okay.
So that's what I mean. We're still doing that. We're just not allowed to do it on American soil anymore.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to keep it any longer, but I have rapid fire questions. So I'm going to say any phrase or word, and you got to respond with one word. Okay? All right. So we have United States.
Awesome.
Bitcoin.
Unintelligible.
What else do we have? Stock market.
Fiction.
Okay. I don't know. Economy.
House of Cards.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, Liam Anderson, thank you for coming on the show. I enjoyed it. Maybe we can do another one again. Man, I have so many notes I wrote for this thing, and we only covered a couple bullet points. So maybe that means we need to have another one.
We both bullshit too much. That's the problem, guys.
Yeah, that's the thing. But anyway, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Sure, no problem at all. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Carlos.